what's up guys, welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, then welcome to our little corner of the internet. Today we're going to be watching a video titled The Other American Colonies They Don't Teach You About. Let's see what this video is about.
The American Revolution, when Britain was defeated by its 13 original colonies. American History 101, right? But if you look at a map of British colonies in the area, you'd see that Britain had way more colonies than just those 13. Some were in Canada, but most were here in the Caribbean. And the thing is, the mainland colonies and island colonies were close. They weren't physically connected, but they were connected socially and by trade. They both wanted to build their fortunes, they both practiced slavery, they both got hit with the same annoying taxes from Britain. And while there's some ocean between them, it still took about half the time to travel from the mainland to the islands, then back to Britain. But when these 13 North American colonies started a revolution, their neighbors to the south didn't. So why didn't the Caribbean colonies join America in the Revolutionary War? Let me give you a hint. Sugar is going to play an important role in this story. But first, let's set the scene in the Caribbean. There are about 26 islands that indigenous peoples called home for thousands of years. Starting in the 1400s, Europeans descended on the region. Imperial powers like England, Spain, France, and the Netherlands all seized resource-rich islands, and they fought over them constantly. Tobago, for example, had been claimed by various European nations on 33 separate occasions. Britain controlled
Look at how pretty.
various European nations on
Wow.
33 separate occasions. Britain controlled about a dozen key islands in the West Indies, including Barbados, Grenada, the Leeward Islands, and its crown jewel, Jamaica. Jamaica was the largest and richest colony in the entire empire thanks to its sugar plantations. Then in 1765 came one of the first sparks of the revolution, the Stamp Act. It was a direct tax on all the American colonies, which required them to pay for a literal stamp on legal and official papers. People were outraged. They protested violently against taxation without representation. Colonists in the Caribbean protested too. They even paid more of this tax than the rest of the American colonies. A decade later, as war loomed between the American patriots and Britain, the Jamaican Assembly tried to cool things down. They sent a lobbyist, Richard Glover, to the House of Commons in London with the message that war would be economically disastrous for the Caribbean colonies. But they were too late. In April 1775, the first shots were fired at Lexington and Concord. In July, the new revolutionaries to the north extended their, quote, warmest gratitude for your pathetic mediation on our behalf with the crown. Shade aside, Connecticut did invite Jamaica to join a committee of correspondence, which were groups formed to coordinate against the British. But to the Caribbean colonists, this was a civil war, and they wanted no part of it. To understand why, we need to understand the decision makers, aka the white colonists that own plantations in the Caribbean colonies.
There's a lot going on.
Sugar and slavery had made these men obscenely wealthy. They were 50 times richer than the average Englishman and 35 times richer than the typical North American colonist. Adjusting for inflation, the wealth of the West Indies was more than 4 billion pounds. Unlike American colonists, the majority of these sugar barons didn't live in the colonies. They preferred Britain, where they could spend their fortunes in style, build opulent estates, and put their kids in elite schools. By 1800, 2/3 of Jamaican planters lived in England. This meant that Caribbean planters kept closer ties to the British crown. Their loyalties were both social and economic. For all the sugar the British Caribbean planters produced, the sugar from the French colonies was consistently cheaper. The French had access to more fertile land and controlled their plantations more efficiently by actually living there. So to keep their Caribbean sugar industry afloat, the government mandated that only British sugar could be sold in Britain, effectively creating a monopoly for Caribbean planters. Jamaica alone produced 40% of Britain's sugar and 90% of the rum. It was a deal that the Caribbean colonists couldn't refuse, much less lose by rebelling. On top of that, the North American colonies refused to offer the same exclusive trade deal. They kept buying sugar and other staples from the French West Indies. That turned out to be a major roadblock to an alliance between the Caribbean and North American colonies. But the biggest reason why the island colonists didn't revolt is because they lived in constant terror of another kind of rebellion, one from below. Racial demographics were key to the Revolutionary era.
I still don't understand. Like, I would love to see or hear. I'm sure there's like journals or like, what is it called? Books written by slaves of how, because I just couldn't imagine a person waking up having slaves and like being okay with it. I don't know.
In the British Caribbean, enslaved Black people outnumbered white slave owners up to 22-1. There was an estimated 416,000 Black people to 50,000 white people in the Caribbean. It was the exact opposite in North American colonies, which had 460,000 Black people to 2 million white people. The Caribbean's racial breakdown was partly due to colonists living in Britain, like I mentioned, but also because sugarcane is an incredibly labor-intensive crop to grow. After being trafficked from Africa, enslaved people lived for an average of 13 years before succumbing to the brutal working conditions enforced by overseers. This tragically short life.
I was just like seeing one of the photos. There was like a kid who was close to a slave owner, I guess. And I was like, oh, maybe it wasn't that bad. Like maybe, maybe they lived alongside each other, it's like working for someone. But no, clearly not. Clearly, I should leave my delusions elsewhere.
Span meant that Caribbean planters relied on the British slave trade for ever more labor instead of growing their enslaved population through forced birth like in the North American colonies. And while American colonists resented the presence of British soldiers, outnumbered Caribbean planters welcomed these troops to protect them from the threat of slave rebellions, which on the islands were constant. Since the start of chattel slavery, Black people escaped and created free maroon communities, especially on the larger islands. In Jamaica, the British government and leaders of Maroons from Trelawney Town struck a grim peace treaty in 1739 after a decade of fighting. Maroons would be left alone if they agreed to help capture and return anyone who escaped in the future. Resistance to slavery also happened in covert ways. There were instances.
Doesn't that kind of like delete the whole point of it? Like,
resistance to slavery also happened in covert ways. There were instances of suspicious fires and accidental deaths from meals prepared specifically for slave owners. And when the Revolutionary War finally broke out in 1775,
whoop-de-fucking-do. I can't curse on YouTube, that's fine.
it made slave rebellions even more likely. With white colonists distracted by war, enslaved people saw an opportunity to claim their freedom. In fact, enslaved people had planned a massive revolt in Hanover, Jamaica. The rebels timed their plot for July 1776, just as Britain's 50th Regiment troops were leaving to fight in North America. But the plan was foiled by one Edward Chambers. Chambers had one of the largest plantations in Hanover, Jamaica, with almost 800 enslaved people. He found out that his overseer's pistols had been loaded with black sand instead of gunpowder. After almost being killed himself, he discovered that the plot spanned more than 40 estates and some 8,600 enslaved people. It was organized by workers who had the means to travel between estates. Once the plot was discovered, many of the leaders were executed and martial law was declared to restore order. The war also brought a British trade embargo with North America, creating a severe food shortage in the Caribbean, which led to the death of thousands of enslaved people. Famine and unrest led to less sugar production, which was incredibly important to the British government. King George himself said, quote, "Our islands must be defended, even at the risk of an invasion of Britain. If we lose our sugar islands, it will be impossible to raise money to continue the war, and then no peace can be obtained," end quote. So as you can imagine, Britain's attention was split. Instead of focusing all its forces on America, British troops were constantly sailing down to defend the Caribbean territories. This was especially true once France entered the war, as they successfully took the British colonies of Dominica, St. Vincent, Grenada, and Tobago. Ultimately, Britain's desperate attempts to hold on to the Caribbean so weakened their forces in America that they lost one of the last major revolutionary battles at Yorktown. So even though the Caribbean colonies didn't take up arms, they had a huge impact on the Revolutionary War. And it goes both ways. Within a few decades, the aftermath of the American Revolution would pave the way for a life-altering change in the Caribbean: the end of slavery. Post-Revolutionary War, Britain looked terrible on the world stage. Not only had they lost opposing the ideals of freedom, happiness, and justice for all. At this moment, activists in London saw an opportunity. They pushed the anti-slavery movement as a way for Britain to reclaim the moral high ground. Plus, the pro-slavery bloc had been cut in half with the loss of representatives from southern colonies on the American mainland. The majority of enslaved people were forced to work on sugarcane plantations in the Caribbean islands and Latin America, while 4% were taken to the North American mainland. Abolitionists like Ulada Equiano, who was formerly enslaved, began publishing personal accounts, which served as powerful rebukes against slavery, which at this point had stolen the—
See, this is what I was talking about, but I don't know anymore. I was thinking that would be I don't know. I had a really tiny speck of hope that it wasn't as brutal as I have understood it to be, but clearly it's as brutal or even more brutal, and that's just rough.
Lives of more than 12 million African people. Quote, "Oftentimes my heart has bled at these partings, when the friends of the departed have been at the waterside and with sighs and tears have kept their eyes fixed on the vessel till it went out of sight," end quote. In 1807, Britain's parliament outlawed the transatlantic slave trade, but it didn't free the currently enslaved people. So enslaved people took matters into their own hands. In 1831, Jamaican preacher Sam Sharp organized a general strike, spreading across the entire island. More than 20,000 people rose up in one of the largest slave revolts ever in British America. Although Sharp did not survive to see it, 2 years later, Britain finally agreed to free the 750,000 people still enslaved in the British Caribbean colonies over 5 years. This was 30 years before the American Civil War. The British government gave no reparations to enslaved people. Yet, somehow, the government made sure to pay the slave owners, which included members of parliament and clergymen whose generational wealth was passed on to today's titans of British banking, railways, and insurance companies. The Revolutionary War wasn't simply a conflict between America and Britain, it was a world war. In the Caribbean, colonial powers battled fiercely to protect their claim on the islands, from which they extracted their wealth at the untold cost of human lives and suffering. Caribbean people across many of the islands fought for their independence in the mid-1900s, yet the legacy of colonialism lingers. Despite the Caribbean being rich in resources, many descendants of enslaved people still face economic disenfranchisement. Today, it's multinational corporations and the sugar, banana, and oil industries that profit from the resources of Caribbean nations such as Jamaica, Trinidad, and the Windward Islands. Even though the Caribbean colonies didn't join the Americans, they ultimately had a massive impact on the course of each other's history. For those of us paying attention, it's a reminder that regardless of borders, our lives and our futures are intertwined. Before you go, we want to tell you about The Story in Us, a new PBS documentary miniseries that explores the universal art of storytelling. Films cover everything from Navajo weavers, West African griots, and the...
Very cool. I mean, yeah, it's I don't know, history is just so wild and crazy, and like the fact that these things have, like, it hasn't even been that long is just even wilder. But yeah, guys, if you do have any book suggestions or documentary suggestions or movie suggestions, please leave them in the comments below. I would love to see what you guys suggest. And thank you so much for joining me for this video. I really hope you found it informative. Please leave a like, subscribe if you haven't yet, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Bye.